we're here today, and we are talking about the new world order, the Great Game 2.0. And why? Because 2020 has certainly been a year which is as consequential to the world as some other years have been in terms of fundamental changes. One thing, you have this particular virus, which traveled in about 6,000 flights from Wuhan and the rest of Hubei province all across the world. I mean, I'm not saying that this was done intentionally, not intentional, but whatever it is, the virus became a frequent flyer and was spread across the world. And secondly, we are now watching the economic impact. The WHO initially decided that the virus was hardly important. Then it decided that travel is not going to really matter, but finally came to a conclusion that it's an extremely deadly virus and you have to shut almost everything down. And and several countries adopted that. And as a consequence, you can see the global economy has gone through some changes. And in the meanwhile, China actually has recovered fairly substantially. So I would only like to say that 2020 is the year of COVID-19. It's the year when the virus traveled across the world. It's also the year when the country where the virus incubated, accidentally, I'm sure, has got out of it much quicker and is doing much better. Now, I'm just going to make one final statement on that. And that country, under the current leader, is very clear that it wants to become at the top of the international order, and it would like to displace the United States at the top of that order. Secondly, that country is very clear its system of governance is far better than the system of governance normal in a democracy. And I'd also like to add that, in so far as COVID is concerned, the kind of restrictions that citizens have undergone as a consequence of COVID 19, well, these are restrictions that have given immense power to the bureaucracy and taken away a lot of initiative from the citizen. So this looks more and more, if I may say so, like the country where COVID first took birth. Immense power to the government and less responsibility to a citizen. And you're seeing that in the lockdowns, you're seeing that in the various procedures and protocols. So that has meant a huge change. But again, an important change, logistics change. Supply chains are now shifting from China to other parts of the world, and India is an important hub for that. Now, in all this, now we have a final change, and that is with the signing of BECA. The India-US foundational agreements have all been signed, and today we can say that the Indo-Pacific partnership of India and the US has been established. I'm really privileged to have on this panel. I'm very privileged to have Air Marshal Masand. I'm very privileged to have Vice Admiral Chauhan, and I'm privileged to have Professor Eric Brown, who's from the Hudson Institute. And I'd like to begin this by talking to Eric. He's talking from quite far away from Washington, D.C. But from there, Eric, how does 2020 look to you? And why is 2020 resulting in such a game changer?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Nalapat, for having me here. It's a real honor to be on this panel. My only wish is that I could be there in Dehradun, which I visited on several occasions in the past for as a launching point for travels up into the Harki Dun Valley and other jaunts into the Garhwal Himalayas. It's a magical part of India, and I only wish I could be there to see my friends face to face. But I think, Madhav, you encapsulated it quite well. 2020, it would be an understatement to say it is a mere inflection point in history. It has had, the pandemic, among other things, has had the effect of accentuating and accelerating a lot of trends which were observable in the world for some time before that. One of the major trends has been the unraveling of the post-1991 geopolitical settlement. And US, for a variety of reasons, I think, has been slow to recognize that. but it has definitely come to be observed by most of the people who are paying attention to the world as it is. Geopolitics are eternal. You could also say the Raja Mandala is constantly turning. And the challenge, I think, for strategy and for the makers of national strategy in both the US and in India is to properly recognize what the present configuration is and where it is likely headed. Madhav, I completely agree that the thing which brings us here today is first and foremost the People's Republic of China. I use the shorthand PRC rather than China to refer to the fact that I don't believe that it is China per se which is our adversary. Rather, the geopolitical quarrel that both India and the United States are in today is with the Chinese Communist Party and its version of the late Manchu Empire. Hence the PRC. And it is the PRC which is striving to make real in the 21st century PRC primacy in Asia, and to establish the one China that has been the vision and the dream of the Chinese Communist Party since its founding in the 1920s. That one China, of course, involves significant portions of so-called blue national soil in the South China Sea, including Taiwan, which has, I should say, never been ruled by a Beijing-based Chinese regime except for 4 years in the 20th century. It had been ruled by the Manchu Empire, but the Manchu Empire, of course, was not run by Chinese. It was run by Manchus. Let us keep that in mind. But PRC's vision of one China also includes enormous swaths of India, of the Indian Himalayas. As we know, PRC has occupied and controlled Tibet for many, many, many decades now. And Tibet is the palm of its five-finger strategy, and PRC seeks control of other parts of what it refers to as southern Tibet, that includes Ladakh, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, and other parts of the Indian Himalayas. I say all this because the challenge, I believe, for both Washington and New Delhi is to recognize that these fights cannot be disconnected in our own national strategies, because they are connected in the minds of the people in Zhongnanhai. We will be far better off on a bilateral and possibly also in larger multilateral fora like the Quad to coordinate our efforts and to understand that the fate and the future of the good order in the Indo-Pacific will be largely defined, in my view, by what is the center of gravity, and that is in India's north, along the Indo-Tibetan border, and stretching from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir all the way to Sikkim and to Yunnan province in the northern parts of Myanmar and Burma. So with that, we can talk about the practical aspects of this. How is PRC attempting to establish its primacy? That, of course, is well aware to the strategists and planners on this panel, and to the people in New Delhi and the leaders here in Washington as well. But since we're at the Valley of Words, I would like to cite, in my own view, one of the best teachers on geopolitics, and that was Rabindranath Tagore. Remember what he said in Home in the World. He said, "Satan cannot enter until he finds a flaw." That was how he encapsulated his analysis of how the East India Company came to dominate in the course of a few generations the entirety of the South Asian, of the Indian subcontinent. That is precisely the strategy that the PRC has been using as it had moved into Pakistan, and it has essentially found a grievance in Rawalpindi GHQ, and it has told Rawalpindi GHQ that it can provide it the money and the wherewithal and the means to achieve what it wants to do. We here in the United States, I think, also see this at play in PRC's outreach to Moscow. The current leaders in Moscow, particularly Vladimir Putin and his ilk, are animated by a desire to avenge an historical injustice. And historical injustice and a history, by the way, that most Americans have view in a very, very distant mirror and have left far behind. But Vladimir Putin is animated by a desire to avenge the historical injury that the political West, as he referred to it, had visited upon the Soviet Union. And it is because of that that he has put himself and his country, his potentially great country, into a subordinate position to the PRC. And the PRC, I believe, has managed to establish considerable control and influence in Moscow, all to the detriment of US security, both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific realm, and also fundamentally to the detriment of India, which of course is the Southern Eurasian power par excellence. I say all of this because this new situation demands far greater direct cooperation between the US and India and the other advanced maritime democracies of Asia and of Europe. And I look forward very much to speaking with all of you about the practical ways that we can begin to think about that. But that is the chessboard as I see it, or the proverbial go board as I see it. And India's security and American security can only be improved by deepening cooperation between our two republics in this particular geopolitical epoch that we find ourselves in. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Nalapat, and I very much look forward to sharing views with the panel and with the audience.
Air power is a very, very important component of national defense, and a reason why countries win wars and some countries lose wars. And now we are privileged to have Air Marshal Harish Masand with us, and Air Marshal Masand has been studying the developments, and I'd like to say that we in India we owe a great debt of gratitude to the Army and also to the Air Force for ensuring that adequate action was taken against the intrusions that have taken place in India since May. And I'd also like to add this, that at a time when the seas were protected by our Navy. So I would like now to get the perspective of the Air Marshal on 2020.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat, for having me on this panel, and my co-panelists, Eric Brown and Vice Admiral Chauhan. Very pleased and very happy, honored to be with you all on this. I'm doing a little bit of ad lib, actually, so I'm going to compress what I had in mind to say about this today. Quite frankly, 2020, or today, the kind of great game that we are talking about, in my opinion, is not just 2.0 version of this game, but if you look at it historically, I rated it as 5.1 version. The 5.0 version actually started between the US and India, US and China, PRC as Eric Brown called it, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific. And the Sino-Indian rivalry, though it's been going on for some time, in my opinion, has been at a much smaller and lower level over the years, and it's now kind of heating up because of the rise of India at the same time, and the interest in shall I say, overlapping areas. So we are in a much later version of this game today, and with the US as the lead player, obviously, because China has been challenging US dominance in this area for almost 3 decades now, openly, and it has made no secret overtake and dominate the world on the global stage and surpass the US by 2049 in its plans. Over here now, India over the years has been, in my opinion, focusing on development because it started off as a very poor country after partition. And it has, quite frankly, not called out China in all its belligerence over the years in many ways, even to the extent of, I would say, what some people have called appeasement, and I agree with that. We haven't stood firm with China over the long term. And it's only now, I would say, under Modi in Doklam and now in Ladakh and other areas, that India has found that this appeasement is not going to work. And it never really worked, actually, because China kept what army slicing, encircling India. And in this, it's used all India's neighbors in SAARC itself, including the major player Pakistan, as a very willing pawn and tool to restrict India within the subcontinent itself and not let it rise even as a regional player, quite frankly. But India is now realizing that, and it's finding ways to try and deter China and to stand up to it. And I think this time, the way it has stood up, the armed forces of India have been an example to all the other smaller countries in the area, which have also been bullied by China over the years, to show them how you can actually call the bluff of China and stand up to this bully. I had this point about the five fingers of the intent of China being the palm, and five fingers, which Eric Brown has mentioned already. And there's been writings actually to say that by 2035, China intends to dismember India into smaller states and back again into various, break up the federation or whatever. So India has no option but to defend its sovereignty and stand up firm and move in that. Quite frankly, air power, the importance of air power only emerged in Spikeman's theory of Rimland, actually, where he mentioned air power for the first time after seeing the effect of air power in the Pacific battles. Today, I would say air power has actually been overtaken by space power, and you can actually reword the earlier theories of Heartland, Mackinder's Heartland, and even Mahan's sea power bit by saying he who controls space controls the air can control the planet tomorrow. So quite frankly, I think all the countries that are now perturbed by China have to look further into the forms of power which extend into space. And here, fortunately, India is a good, cost-effective, and demonstrated capability in space, which it can build on pretty economically and affordably, as indicated by its earlier missions, Chandrayaan and now Mangalyaan, and its plans to send a manned space mission by next year. So quite frankly, we need to focus on space. That is one. Unfortunately, over the years, because of, shall I say, keeping China as a distant threat in the minds of our strategic planners, particularly the political leadership, we have spent very little on defense. As a matter of fact, for the last 2 decades, as I can count it, India has only spent under 1.5% of its GDP on defense, which has brought us to this state where we are, shall I say, the Navy and the Air Force, everything has been kind of not modernized, underfunded, and slightly weaker than it should be for a two-front confrontation. And I go to the extent of saying, and I'm sure Admiral Chauhan will bring it out, that there's a third maritime front now for us, which is far more important actually geostrategically, because it is in the maritime front in the Indian Ocean region where India still holds some advantage, and we have to focus on that. Because of this underfunding, I want to highlight that just one example quickly, because I can't dwell into too much into the other things. The Indian Air Force strength has dropped to almost 32 combat squadrons today, as against a sanctioned strength of 42, and quite frankly, a recommended and required strength of 64 combat squadrons, which was recommended as early as 62 after the war by Tata Committee. But we're down to 32 now and building up very slowly. I don't think China or PRC also wants an outright war, quite frankly. So we need to build up, and we need to confront it in space, in air, in the naval, in the maritime front, as Admiral Chauhan will bring out later, and I won't touch on that. But also on, I would say, cyber. And back again in cyber, India has a indigenous capability which is demonstrated very well by all its IT and information industry that is working so well. And all we need is a focus to harness this capability and work on that, and along with it, with the information and psychological aspects of to contain China. Uh, Lastly, because of time, basically, what I would say is no nation can do it alone in this world, like Eric rightly said. And India has to find coalition and partners, like-minded partners, which can stand up to China and call its bluff. So in this, actually, we are moving correctly with greater and better relations with the U.S. In the last few years, and I hope they will progress further, as you mentioned with Becca. Uh, the only point that I want to make over here in this coalitions is that we should not look at these coalitions only militarily, because after all, it's finally the economic power of a nation which actually makes it play this kind of a game. I mean, without economy, as they say, the old saying is the economy is stupid. So basically, it is in the economic front that we have as an alliance or as a coalition. And as just one example, very briefly, that I'll give you, if even just the Quad today was to coordinate on the economic front, and because of the various conditions of uh, the handling of the pandemic by China, the violations of the IPR, and all the security issues that are being bringing up, the trade wars, if everybody was to join together and move away from China and its investments and manufacturing and move it to suitable countries. I'm not claiming that India is the only suitable country in this area, but India is certainly a very, very strong contender for all the other bits because of the geographical, the demographic, and the educational advantages that it has. All we need in the government is the will and a focus to remove all the impediments on the way, or the deadwood, our progress on the economic front, so that we can bring in most of the industry and manufacturing. And the world today does not see India as a threat later, because India has never been a hegemon, quite frankly. It's over millennia. It has shown no intention of, shall I say, occupying anybody's territory or converting people by forcing its own thoughts, unlike China. So the world actually sees India today, and particularly the opportunity is ideal today because of all the things that are going around, including the pandemic and the distrust that has crept in all the people who've been dealing with China over here, and who do wish to move away from its overdependence on Chinese products and Chinese manufacturing and other things. So I feel, frankly, that if we focus on the economy as an alliance or as a coalition in the Quad, apart from the military aspects to deter China, we have a window of a decade or a decade and a half before China is um, openly going to come out and confront people. With that, I will leave the discussion further. Thank you very much, and I'll be open to questions later, of course, as you say. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much, Air Marshal. I mean, that was certainly a very, very elevated, if I may say so, as befits the Air Force, a view of the, of the whole geopolitical situation, especially what we are facing. I have been intrigued, frankly, about this extreme closeness between the People's Republic of China and countries such as Pakistan, Turkey. I mean, you have, for example, Syria. You have different countries like that, and I've been very intrigued by this alliance between China and countries that, frankly, are now the hubs of groups that are anything but benign. So it's been very interesting, frankly, to see how closely the Chinese have been operating in these countries, and how these countries never call out China, for any of the activities that they are, doing, for example, in Xinjiang. It's very interesting. But I'd like to say that now we are getting on to the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It's now taken root. I don't think that even the Chinese, with their vast amount of lobbying and their vast amount of goodwill that they have, and along with their with their Russian allies and other allies, and incidentally, the very strong Pakistan lobby in Washington, as Eric well knows, and including in the Pentagon, in state, in various parts of the US government, there are embedded, there are groups of individuals who are very, very close to the GHQ Rawalpindi viewpoint. But even then, I think the Indo-Pacific is here to stay, and I'd request Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan was the significance of the Indo-Pacific partnership in the context of 2020.
Thank you very much, Madhav, and thank you. It's a great honor to be here on this stellar panel, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to all of you. It's usually a lament of the last speaker to say that everything that had to be said has been said, but I'm very happy to see that that's not the case on this particular occasion. So I would like to offer you some radically different points of view and perspectives, and I hope I use the word radically with some justification. Let me start by saying that I have strong. Let me start with an assertion. In the next 100 or 200 years, India will either succeed as a nation or will fail. But the determinant of our success or our failure will be how cleverly, how adroitly, how adeptly, how dexterously we are able to dance upon the maritime domain, because these 200 odd years are going to be about the seas. Consequently, with great respect, I would like to offer that this great game, there are many great games going on. Several shades of a great game, which is what makes it great. Bertil Lintner wrote a rather interesting book somewhat recently where he said that the great game is about the Buddhist Himalayas. We've got Professor Brown, who says that the center of gravity is the trans-Himalayan border. I think that is something that I deeply disagree with. So let me offer you some justification for my provocative statements. First, I'd like to address this business of COVID, because that was one of the terms of reference that Professor Nalapat placed before us. We have done in my foundation a fairly detailed study on the various influenza-based epidemics or pandemics that have occurred in the last 100 years, and their economic impact, and also the number of deaths, but more than anything else, the economic impact and how long an economic impact lasts. And the short answer is it lasts for 2 years. So while for 2 years, everybody will focus upon tackling COVID and COVID-related infirmities, and it will not be long before the world will go back to a pre-COVID or a post-COVID point where grand geopolitics will once again take center stage. And this St. John's ambulance kind of utilization of every country's armed force will have to stop. The second point I wanted to make was that the Indian armed forces dealing with China militarily have a deep understanding of the concept of maneuver. Maneuver is inbuilt in the Indian military and Indian strategic and psyche, and the psyche prevailing at the level of operational art. So when you apply maneuver and you restrict your concept of maneuver to a core sector of 30 corps or 31 corps or 32 corps or 33 corps, whichever corps, one army corps sector, then you have missed the woods for the trees altogether. Because you have not understood the concept of maneuver in theater. And the concept of theater is relatively less expounded upon in India than it ought to be. So where asymmetries do exist, as the Air Marshal pointed out, we must be in a position to leverage those asymmetries that are existing in our favor. There are two of them. One, for China, not coming to the Indian Ocean is a non-starter. It's not because they want to surround India, but because China's economy will drive China willy-nilly into putting into place those assurance and insurance mechanisms that are represented by the armed forces and by diplomacy, that means the tools of foreign policy, in this area. China is highly unlikely to remain satisfied with being the primary power in the South China Sea. I think Professor Brown alluded to the game of Go in the same breath as the game of chess, and this, I think, is a fundamental error should we end up concentrating upon chess acumen and not worry about Weishi. So Go requires the consolidation of one corner before you can move forward. The movement forward is nothing to do with your non-geoeconomic goals alone. It is to do with geoeconomics. China can't do without those geoeconomic drivers, and those geoeconomic drivers lie either in the Indian Ocean or must transit the Indian Ocean. Therefore, China's movement of its assurance and insurance mechanisms into the Indian Ocean is a given. Now, unlike in the Trans-Himalayan border, the maritime space is the only one in which consolidation of countries' assets can take place, of several countries. We have already spoken about the Quad, and so I think that I'll leave it at that because everybody is familiar with that particular quadrilateral. But there are other countries also who are more than willing to handle China at the strategic level before coming to any push coming to shove on the military level at sea. And therefore, I emphasize the fact that India should not be looking at the Indo-Pacific from any other lens than an Indian lens. What does that mean? It means that India pursues, promotes, preserves, protects its maritime interests. And its maritime interests are India's. They are not determined by any other country. If you magically, sir, were able to erase China from the map of the earth, it would not affect one Indian interest one whit. Those are ours. Now, the degree of risk that is imposed upon our ability to attain those, to pursue those, to protect those interests in times of peace, in times of tension, in times of conflict, that might be impacted by China. In this particular case, I don't need to say other countries or name them. So in our approach of saying that we are willing and able to be a net provider of security, which is quite different from this horrendous noun string called net security provider, where you have no idea which words are hyphenated by which. So we are a net provider of security. And this is done by India by concentrating upon the strength area of India, which is our capability. Capacity is material wherewithal. You don't have a patrol boat, I give you a patrol boat, I've doubled your capacity. What does that have to do with capability? Do you know how to operate the boat? Do you know how to, do you have a life cycle costing for it? Do you have legal structure? Do you have a training infrastructure? Yes, 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 yes. Wow, you have capability. No, 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 and no. You only have a liability. Therefore, the countries of this region that act or who operate in this region that actually have capacity must and do throw capacity at a problem. Those who have capability must throw capability at the problem. We are foolish if we think that we should be throwing capacity, which is our weak suit, as opposed to capability, which is our strong suit. So when we have this interaction with the Quad or with the United States of America, we must both bring something to that table that is not going to be subjected to the law of diminishing returns. Otherwise, this joint venture will fail, as is a foundational concept in all joint ventures. Let me turn quickly to the point about 2049 and China's dreams. China is a country that lays great store by the concept of face. This is very, very different from India, or America, where there are concepts of honor, there are concepts of respect, but face is a typically East Asian concept which has received less than absolute academic study. But for a nation that lays such store by the concept of face, to give a date by which it will do something or become something is a huge strategic mistake. And if that nation has conflict, what is India's core national interest? It is to assure the economic, material, and societal well-being of the people of India. Isn't that the same as China? No, because in China's case, as Professor Brown said, the people of China has been conflated as a term to equal the CPC. And the CPC seems to have been having its face conflated with the face of Xi Jinping. And as you very well know, in life, it is often important to be right or wrong, but it is also very important to have somebody to blame. And Xi Jinping has removed everybody that could be blamed. Now, as 2049 approaches, which is only 29 years away, a nation will become more and more frenetic. It will become more and more mistake prone because you have removed your capacity, historical capacity of operating in the long run or the long game, and you are now forced to do something quickly. Now, what we should be doing, all of us, is identifying in conjectural terms what constitutes a strategic mistake and how will we identify it, and therefore what ought we to do about it, and not worry too much about the small aspects that are operating within that particular area. Insofar as this space is concerned, if China has to operate maritime forces here, we must be able to find mechanisms by which China is compelled to move maritime forces beyond the range of shore-based protection of its air power. Bring it here, where we have the advantage. Why would we want to go into China's killing grounds? It is it should be our approach to bring China into our killing ground. What does that mean? It means that at the geopolitical level, at the geo-economic level, and at the military strategic and military operational levels, there is one country that we must woo, we must simply give the highest priority to, and that is Indonesia. When we talk about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap in the Cold War, God gave the NATO forces Duke. God has given us the Strait of Ombai Wetar. And yet, even today, no matter how many times we say this Ombai Wetar, so many senior analysts will turn around and look at me and say, same to you. And yet, the Strait of Ombai Wetar is the only strait through which nuclear-propelled large submarines of any country can transit between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. Indonesia sits astride every one of those straits, but most importantly, sits astride the Strait of Ombai Wetar. And that area is what the Quad, it need not make it public, it need not publicize it, but that's the area that we should be concentrating upon. This business of trying to have an attrition-based movement where your strength is pitted against China's strength cannot lead to anything more than a simple stalemate. You want to defeat China at the strategic table, you have to be able to bring it and operate it and play it at sea. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to say that I fully agree with you about Indonesia, and I fully agree with the Air Marshal regarding the importance of economics. If you remember the HIV pandemic, HIV was a killer disease. And it was a killer. Finally, it became a killer disease only for the poor. But even that was removed because now 90% of 100% of AIDS can be treated by therapeutics, and more than 90% of those therapeutics are produced in India. I think the same trajectory is likely to happen with this particular virus. Even if we are not fortunate enough to get a vaccine, and we have tried very hard to get a vaccine for AIDS, it hasn't worked. It mutates too fast. Well, I think the fact is that Donald Trump's recovery from COVID-19 showed the importance of therapeutics. And there I would like to say, possibly this gives a second opportunity to India to ensure that therapeutics and therapeutic cocktails are produced in immense number to benefit the whole world. This is just one of the ways in which the Air Marshal's vision of economics goes into play. Another is what Professor Brown was talking about, and I think what he was talking about was basically implying in terms of platforms being based in India, US platforms being based in India and being used in a sense, and that would be an advantage because if part of the production of certain very good platforms are based in India, they will be price competitive with the Sino-Russian alliance in a way that is not possible if every bit of them is produced only in the United States. Having said that, I'd like to say that, look, if, with your permission, we have covered a lot of territory, and I think we have covered some very important grounds on all three speakers. I'd like to give a final opportunity to the three speakers to basically, if you're basically pointing at the main opportunity and the main challenge that is being faced by the world, what exactly, in your view, would that be, and what the challenge is, and what the opportunity is of facing it and overcoming it? Eric, can we start with you again, please?
Great. I'll do my best. I wanted to say that I very much appreciate both the Vice Admiral and the Air Marshal's comments. They're very, very helpful. I agree fundamentally, as a citizen of a faraway quasi-island called the United States, that our main focus needs to be in the maritime realm. What I was referring to was, however, that the PRC's pressure on India and on Indian security is largely going to come in the years ahead, in my view, against India's north. And that India's capacity to deal with those challenges will be fundamentally affected by its economic power, not necessarily by its military capacity, but its economic power. And the best way for India to build the $10–15 trillion economy that's required to absorb the enormous youth, the raw potential of the Indian Republic, is to build out a base of operations in the Indo-Pacific theater, from Africa to Southeast Asia. And that should be the focus. That seizing the Indo-Pacific advantage, I think, is necessary to achieve the parity that India requires to maintain its security in the north. And by that security, I mean not just to establish strategic parity with the PRC, but to absorb the enormous number of people that India has in the north, and to be able to deal with the complexity of challenges that India faces there. That cannot be achieved with PRC's help, because PRC will not allow India to achieve a $10–15 trillion economy. That cannot be done through Russia. It could not be done on the Eurasian landmass. It can only be done by finding those complementarities that Madhav and the Air Marshal spoke about, in terms of developing economic capabilities, economic potential, technology, and building out an ecosystem in the Indian Ocean that allows for India to harness its potentials internally. Thank you.
Air Marshal?
Well, I'll take off from thank you again for the opportunity, and I'll just expand on what I said. I couldn't agree with Admiral Chauhan more, and that's why I said the maritime front will take over, because quite frankly, while Professor Brown is absolutely right that China is going to play its game in the Himalayas, quite frankly, we are at a great advantage in the maritime front, quite even today, and at least for a decade or more before China has enough strength to be able to come into the Indian Ocean region. Like Admiral Chauhan said, we don't have to go into his killing ground, but we have to lure him into where he's weak, and he's going to be weak, shall I say, from the Straits of Malacca and Indonesia down till the Arabian Sea. But my focus will still remain on the economics, and I feel that the opportunity today couldn't be better. With all that is going on in the world and the distrust of China, this is what our coalition, any coalition that we build with like-minded nations, should focus on. Military will continue. We have to deter China. Nobody wants an outright war with China. Even China doesn't want an outright confrontation or outright war with either the US or with India by itself, because while it may hurt us, he's not going to go without a bloody nose himself. So quite frankly, Xi, in my opinion, today is looking for a face saving out because of all the people who gathered around India in support of what's going on, and recognizing India's challenges and sovereignty. I'm sorry, is there some background going on? Background noise that I hear? So I think something is wrong with my mic, but I will end here. Maybe I'll expand a little later. And quite frankly, we need to capitalize on this opportunity in terms of the economic growth and not make the $5 trillion economy a mere slogan or a 10 or 15. Why not? India's potential in the long run is far more than China, quite frankly, because it's a democracy, because it's stable, it has a legal framework, and all the advantages it enjoys, which a controlled society like China does not. And we should capitalize on it by removing all the impediments on the way to build that kind of an economy. And obviously, the military and other forms of power will flow to enable us to play this game even better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vice Admiral, over to you.
Thank you once again. I just wanted to say that I think that the single largest challenge that is currently going to face the world is rapid economic recovery. And the greatest challenge that will face India, as has already been explained, will be pretty much a subset of that. How rapidly and how dynamically can we leverage technology, for example, to effect a economic recovery? But this economic recovery, sir, is a function of how well we are able to reestablish the sinews of trade, of maritime trade. In India's case, 90% of all our trade, all our merchandise trade flows by sea. And today we have almost 37% of our merchandise trade as a function, as the percentage value supporting our GDP. In the case of China, it is almost 40%, and that's not including services. So I think that if trade is to continue, if ports are to be developed, both inboard and outboard, then what you do need to focus upon is a rules-based order in which the rules are themselves founded by international consensus and not founded solely in Beijing. So we need to tackle the foundational points even while we tackle the platform-based activities that will support an economic recovery so as to be able for India to achieve this $5 trillion economy. For achieving that, of course, we need a much more dynamic port infrastructure development model in which Sagar and Sagarmala are pulling in the same direction and not in opposite ones, in which we are able to bring the neighborhood's requirements and sensitivities into our frame, working out more clever mechanisms for financial sharing and profit sharing and these sorts of things. But it will depend upon the development, perhaps joint development, I hope, of matrices of efficiency that can be applied to ports so that we get the best bang for our buck, so that we are able to maximize our shipping and our trade via that shipping, and so that we can actually go in for the port-led development that our country needs and without which you cannot approach $5 trillion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are, of course, going to move into question answers subsequently. But I just like to say that, look, if China is interested in basically dominating the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, the entire Indo-Pacific, if it can break through the first island chain, for example, by taking over Taiwan without a war, it would be delighted. If it can establish complete control of the South China Sea, including the waters which it now shares with other countries in ASEAN, it would be delighted. And if it can completely dominate the Himalayan Massif, it would be delighted. They are going to be relentless in pursuing these objectives. And yes, I agree. No, I mean, they do not want a war. Nobody really wants a war. But what they are banking on is that in democracies, people definitely do not want a war. I mean, as the Air Marshal pointed out, India's own defense spending has been tiny. India's own reliance on foreign countries for its defense, critical defense needs is huge. But the reality is that is the world going to just stand by as it has stood by for so many years now and accept the way the PRC is establishing its control first over Asia, a unipolar Asia, and then finally a unipolar world. I would only like to point out the defense of this entire Indo-Pacific hinges on defending the Indo-Pacific and looking at it as an entirety. If tomorrow Japan becomes weak, if Japan becomes weak, the Quad gets shaky. If the Quad gets shaky, there'll be problems facing India. So the same way, the Himalayan Massif, if there is a major setback to India in the Himalayas, and I'm very confident that's not going to happen, our Army, Navy, and Air Force will ensure the setback is on the other side. But the Chinese will be looking at that humiliation because they know India is the only alternative, frankly, to them. And if India is humiliated, then they feel that allies will not come to India, the Indian people get demoralized, and this 2049 project of which we were talking about can come closer to a reality. So I only want to say, nobody, yes, countries do not want a war, but there are wars that happen, and we have to be prepared for it. And in that, partnerships, strategy, tactics is very important. And I, for one, am very, very glad that the two largest democracies of the world are coming together in this kind of an Indo-Pacific partnership. And let's end this particular segment. And again, I'd like to thank the Air Marshal. I'd like to thank the Vice Admiral. I'd like to thank Professor Brown from Hudson for very interesting and unique insights into the security dilemmas that we face. And let me tell you, these are serious dilemmas. We are talking about war and peace. We are talking about not only success, but a high price if we fail. And the Chinese also are going for broke. If in the Himalayan Massif, if across the Taiwan Straits, if in the South China Seas, they are humiliated in a military encounter, it will have a tectonic effect on the leadership structure in China, the Communist Party of China, and the governing apparatus in China. So this is a game of very high stakes with this 2.0, and I'm so happy that some parts of it have been made clear by our three discussants. Thank you very, very much for this segment.